Hey everyone, and welcome to the ATA podcast. I'm Matt Baird.
And I'm Andie Ho. This podcast is brought to you by the American Translators Association. Each month, we bring you news and insights from ATA. We look at what's happening across the association, explore the benefits of membership, and discuss the translation and interpreting professions.
That's right. You know, the T&I industry is always changing, and we hope this podcast will help you keep up with it. ATA was founded over 60 years ago to advance the translation and interpreting professions and foster the professional development of individual translators and interpreters. We have nearly 9,000 members in more than 100 countries.
If you'd like to know more about ATA, we'll have some information for you at the end of the show. And you'll also find links in the notes.
All right, let's get started with a few quick announcements.
ATA has some exciting webinars coming up. There's Taking Control of Your Business by Fernando Cunhado on June 15, which is free to ATA members. Or there's Healthcare Equity and Language Access in Indigenous Populations by William Giller on June 21st. And Integrate ChatGPT in Your Workflows to Boost Productivity by Daniel Shabesta on June 28th. Both are $45 for ATA members and $60 for non-members, and earn you one continuing education point. Check out our online calendar to find future ATA events and continue growing as a professional. Did you miss the ATA virtual conference? You're in luck. The recording is now available for purchase. Find a link in today's show notes. Thanks again to our sponsors, organizers, speakers, and over 500 attendees who made Translating and Interpreting the Future an exciting and insightful event. Finally, registration for ATA 64 will open this summer, so get ready. This year's conference will be held in sunny Miami. You won't want to miss it. More details are coming soon.
We're joined today by Ben Karl, who is a certified translator and copywriter based in Long Beach, California, specializing in corporate communications, marketing, and user experience. He's on the ATA Board of Directors. He edits the French Language Division newsletter. And the reason we've asked him here today is because he chairs the ATA Advocacy Committee. So thank you for joining us today, Ben.
Thank you for having me, Andie.
Real quick, let's start with an overview of what the Advocacy Committee does and why it was originally formed for those listeners who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, so the Advocacy Committee is one of the older committees at ATA. And if you look at our charge, it describes a lot of activities that actually don't necessarily apply to the Advocacy Committee anymore. Our charge, like the charges of all the committees at ATA, have evolved over time to better serve the needs of our members. But one thing is certain and clear. ATA's mission specifically calls out advocacy as a big reason for why the association exists and one of the major benefits to our members. And so really the purpose of the Advocacy Committee today is to keep track of issues that affect our professions and the communities that we serve, both at the state and federal level, and even at the local level, in many cases, to inform people about these issues, to inform our members and stakeholders in government or elsewhere of the implications of these issues, and then to encourage our members to take action to make sure that their voices are heard, and ultimately to empower our members to become better advocates, both for freelance professionals, for language professionals, and for people with limited English proficiency, which are a major constituency of the people that we serve with our jobs.
So a lot of members first became familiar with the Advocacy Committee thanks to AB5 several years ago. But for listeners who are unfamiliar with AB5, can you give us an overview of what that is and what that involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So AB5 was a law in California, is still currently a law in California, that codified into law a California Supreme Court decision that basically worked on or had to do with classifying employees versus contractors. And so it was a law that was originally created by organized labor predominantly to help with a really legitimate issue, which was that there was a classification, or rather a category of workers that really were being exploited by a certain cohort of companies. In my view, that's a personal view of mine, that these workers really were not being treated fairly. They were working very often over 40 hours a week for a particular employer, but they were not entitled to the benefits or privileges of being an employee. So this law was created to correct that. But what wound up happening was that it applied a very strict ABC test, which was code for the sections in the law that these provisions referred to. And one of them in particular was very onerous for translators and basically made it so that translation agencies would be unable to work with freelance translators or interpreters in the state of California. And so, as you can imagine, this created quite the stir and had a lot of far-reaching implications for our members, several of whom had their contracts unilaterally canceled with a lot of LSPs. They were invited to move out of state in order to be able to continue working for some of their larger clients. So it really had far-reaching implications. And so the previous chair of advocacy, Lorena Ortiz-Schneider, she was very involved in advocating for our profession and winning an exemption from AB 5, which came in the form of another bill called AB 2257. And so translators have a full exemption from AB 5 in the state of California. Interpreters have a less clear exemption, but an exemption nonetheless. So it's an area that we are still working on, and the fact that other states now, and even at the federal level, there are laws that are similar to AB 5 cropping up, really mean that our work in terms of worker classification is not over. So worker classification is one of the really important advocacy issues that we're working on right now, and among many others. And so AB 5 was sort of the impetus to not revive, because the committee's been here the whole time, but really to kick the committee into overdrive, so to speak. And so we've been riding that momentum ever since.
Well, congratulations on getting the carve out in the California bill.
Thank you very much.
What do you think going forward, if other states are looking to adopt a similar bill, or even at the federal level, what might be a more efficient way of getting an exemption for translators and interpreters that doesn't involve a carve out? Or is that the best way to go about it?
I think, there are differing legislative strategies and sort of philosophical viewpoints for this. There are workers, and certainly there are likely translators and interpreters who are misclassified as contractors when they really should be classified as employees. From our perspective, though, there are mechanisms in place that allow misclassified workers to gain the right kind of classification through mechanisms that are already in place. The issue with laws like AB 5 and this ABC test, and there's actually currently a bill being put forward in the state of Michigan, and there's also the Federal PRO Act, which would impose similar restrictions at the federal level. The issue with those bills is that they don't give highly skilled freelance professionals like translators and interpreters the choice of how they would like to be classified. And it forces, in many cases, their clients to regard them as employees, even though for many this doesn't make any sense. And an example that I like to use locally is that we have a lot of Cambodians who live in Long Beach, California, and they speak a language called Khmer. And there are very few institutions outside of the city of Long Beach that have such a high need for Khmer interpreting that it would make sense to have an employee who can work 40 hours a week interpreting in Khmer. That said, there are lots of institutions and organizations that have very timely needs that might be an hour or two a week here and there. And so those interpreters really, in order to make a living and to serve the needs of this limited English proficient community, would need to work as contractors for sometimes dozens of clients in order to one, make a good living, and two, help this community to communicate with the institutions that they need to communicate with, be that the healthcare system, the judicial system, etc. So there's no one size fits all, and that's really the problem with a lot of these laws. They try to impose one size on sort of the diversity of the professional relationships that we have as translators and interpreters. And so our philosophy is that translators and interpreters should have a choice. And so that's what we advocate for when we see this kind of legislation cropping up.
All right. Well, what about besides 85? What has the Advocacy Committee been working on so far this year? And what are they looking at for the rest of the year?
That's a really great question. So the advocacy landscape is very fluid and dynamic and changing all the time. And I would encourage anybody, whether you're listening to this podcast right when it comes out or later in the year or maybe years from now, to check out the advocacy and outreach tab on the ATA website. It's where all of our really most recent advocacy actions, calls to action, and news get published. So that's where you can go for the latest information. But a lot of the issues that we are focusing on right now, and many of these issues are brought to us by ATA members. And as ATA members, you have access to our committee and can request assistance whenever you have an issue that's affecting you in your community or in your state. Some of these issues recently have included interpreter compensation in the state of South Carolina, for example. Interpreter compensation in lots of states, actually. As we all know, compensation is a huge issue or huge question for freelance professionals. And when rates are set, potentially 20 years ago and haven't been adjusted since for cost of living or inflation or anything like that, professionals who continue to accept those rates are effectively taking a pay cut. And so we do a lot of work writing letters to councils, to procurement departments, to even the Supreme Court of the state of South Carolina, for example, to advocate for higher pay and better terms and working conditions for interpreters. Another big issue that we focus on at every level is language access, which is a federally protected right, whereby limited English proficient individuals cannot be discriminated against based on whether or not they speak English proficiently. And so that means that, in a nutshell, if you are an agency or organization that accepts federal funding, you have to provide an interpreter or translator to communities that request it so that they can use your services, be that the courts, healthcare, education, etc. And so a lot of our work focuses on informing where we can that those communities that they have this right, and then helping organizations develop things like language access plans, effective ways to work with interpreters and translators, and when that isn't happening, to remind them that it's an important right that they need to fulfill, or else they could get into a lot of trouble. Basically, the liability for folks not following or complying with that rule is pretty serious. So, for example, we've written letters to state governments or state and city governments that haven't provided interpreters at important council meetings, for example. We've written a letter recently to the state of Oregon that was trying to change how interpreters are used for hospital interpreting, medical interpreting. And the issue is really quite complex, and we not everyone agreed with the position that we took, but the position that we put on the website really explains things clearly. And we hope that we can work with stakeholders at every level to make sure that legislation benefits both our members, certified and uncertified, and the communities that they serve, which is really the most important thing.
Okay, you say stakeholders at every level. So you've been talking mostly about working on governmental policy, but you do work at all levels, public and private.
Public and private. So we In theory, yes. We haven't been working very closely or very much with private entities at the moment, but really a lot of the advocacy issues that we work on are ones that are brought to us by our members. So we try to empower our members to do things that are really seem very little in the grand scheme of things, but that really do count as advocacy. And an example that we love to bring up on the committee is if you're an interpreter, for example, and you've been contracted to work for, a half day, that you sometimes need to inform the person that you're contracting with that it is customary for there to be paired interpreting, that one interpreter can't really accurately or physically interpret for 6 hours straight. That's simply not possible. And so informing your clients that you need a partner and that your partner, these are the terms for working with two people, and this is why it's important. And, advocating for the working conditions that you need with a client or a potential client also counts as advocacy. And so we typically don't get involved in issues like that because they don't get brought to us, but we certainly could if we were asked to, or if it were a persistent problem or something like that. And really what we try to do, and what a big project that we've been working on, is creating a resource library for our members to put resources at their fingertips that allow them to have the language that they need to advocate, not just to legislators, for example, but to their own clients. And so that's a project that's been ongoing, and we're really looking forward to putting resources on the website soon.
Okay, so that's half answers my next question. You've been talking about advocacy at a very high level, and then you mentioned advocacy on the most grassroots level, educating individual clients. What is some in-between way that an average person like me, who isn't quite ready to join the advocacy committee, can take that is more than just, one client at a time?
Absolutely. So really, advocacy is sort of it's a relationship building exercise. And so the best advocates, I think, are ones that are dialed in, but who have relationships with people who are decision makers, for example. And so the process of advocacy is really working to cultivate those relationships over time. And what I mean by that is, if there's legislation in your state that affects limited English proficient individuals, or that affects translators and interpreters writ large, making sure that your elected officials know that you are a translator or an interpreter, a captioner, someone who helps folks access services that are important in your state, and then maintaining those relationships to the point where one day, if that legislator has a question about translation or interpreting, they actually think to call you instead of somebody else. And so something that ATA has done is created resources that attract those kinds of questions from decision makers. And one that's an example is our position paper on remote simultaneous interpreting. It was recently sort of the key to a door that allowed us to participate in creating an amicus brief that was submitted to the Supreme Court of the state of New Jersey. And actually oral arguments in that case are going to be starting very soon. And it relates to a remote simultaneous interpreting case, or remote simultaneous interpreting issue in a criminal case that involves a defendant that speaks a very rare indigenous language. And so it's also a very complex issue, but that we were invited to participate on and speak on because of the resources that we had put out there. And so essentially what we would like to help our members do is give them the tools and the resources and the language to create relationships like that with their officials at the state level, at the local level, their city council people, their assembly people, their state senators, etc., all these folks, so that if there is, a question about translation or interpreting someday in the future, they get a call or they get an email from someone at that office. And so it isn't necessarily, having the president of the United States on the phone or the Speaker of the House on speed dial. It's really, grassroots is where it's at, really. And local regulation and politics really affect us far more than the national politics, I think, if we're talking, things that affect our everyday lives, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's not just writing letters to senators. It's really telling your city council people that language access in your community is important, and this is why. And so all of it's important, but I think even the grassroots stuff is the most important, I would argue.
I remember when the ATA conference was in DC some years ago, there was a special session to teach members how to visit their representatives' offices and actually meet with them and discuss T&I issues. And we did that. And that was a revelation to me that, as a citizen, I could just make an appointment with my, state representative or mayor or whoever and basically walk into their office and talk to them. I mean, in reality, it was often an aide. But yeah, we have access at that level to these people.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you said that, because it's something that I think we forget. We put our elected officials on these pedestals sometimes, but they work for us. They work for their constituents. And so you do have the right to, really for any reason, schedule a meeting with your elected official. And they are very often very happy to talk to you, and they want to hear from you. And I love that you mentioned the Capitol Hill visit during the conference in DC. And I think it's really a great moment to mention that the Advocacy Committee has ambitions to create a similar event in the future for ATA. Members of our committee and a lot of ATA members already participate in other congressional action days like that are organized by other associations. The JNCL is one, ALC is one. And so since the pandemic, actually, most of those kinds of action days have gone virtual, which on the one hand means that you don't get as much literal FaceTime with the staff or even your representative or your elected official. But it also makes these events much more accessible and much less expensive, which is something that I know ATA members are particularly conscious of. And so in the future, we would really like to organize a congressional action day where we set up meetings with participants, representatives, and elected officials, and get them in the room with them so that we can talk about issues that are important to us as translators and interpreters. So stay tuned for that. That is on our roadmap. That is something that we're really interested in doing. And if anyone listening now would like to get involved or help with that, please feel free to reach out to the Advocacy Committee.
All right, you're reading my mind. I was just about to ask you if you have any specific tasks or projects that you are looking for volunteers for, whether as an official advocacy committee member or just as an ad hoc, someone to fulfill a specific task. Do you have any things you can name that people can kind of chew on?
Always. I think, our ambitions as a committee are really only held back by our bandwidth, really. And, we're all volunteers. ATA runs on volunteer work. And thank you, Andie, for being a great volunteer and doing this podcast, and for everything else that you do too. This association is really as strong as its members make it, right? So we always have something that we need help with. And typically it involves drafting letters or reviewing letters, the things that we send out to the officials that we're trying to contact. We are working very hard on creating a resource library, and that also requires people with good writing skills to work on the templates and the articles and the things like that we want to post on our website. And then really, we just need help keeping track of issues. So when, a law is put forward, or when a bill rather is proposed in a particular jurisdiction, sometimes we don't know about those. We don't know that they're happening. We try to keep our eyes and ears open, but really our members are our eyes and ears too. And so whether you are interested in joining the committee and helping us to draft the statements that actually get signed by ATA's president and sent out, or if you just think you saw something that we might be interested in and that we should be aware of, be it a regulation or a new rule or a bill, or you hear about a school in the district where your kids go, not providing language access, or not hiring a qualified interpreter, or anything like that. We would love to hear from you. We would love to maybe rely on you for a little bit of support, especially at the local level. So there's always something to do. And I can tell you that advocacy is a really, really fulfilling and fast-moving committee where you really get to see your work in action right away. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested to please get in touch.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ben. And thank you to all the members of the Advocacy Committee for everything that you do and for watching out for us and for the profession.
Thank you, Andie. Thank you very much. And the Advocacy Committee can be reached at advocacy@atanet.org. We have our own email address. So please feel free to write to advocacy@atanet.org or to reach out to me directly. I'm pretty easy to find. If you would like to get involved, if you have any questions, any feedback, we would love to hear from you. We represent a really wide and diverse group of people, and there are lots of perspectives, lots of considerations, and the more feedback, the better, really. So don't hold back. We would love to hear from you, and we hope you do soon.
All right. Thank you, Ben, for your time.
Thank you, Andie. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. That's a wrap. We'd like to thank everyone who helped produce today's show.
Cris Silva recorded the announcements. Derek Platts mixed and edited the audio. ATA headquarters provided editorial and technical support.
If you learned anything new in today's podcast, I bet there's someone out there who would like to know it too. Don't be stingy. Tell them about the podcast. I've gotten to know so many great podcasts that way. I promise they'll thank you for it.
And if you're not an ATA member, listen up. I've been a member for over 20 years. Joining ATA literally launched my freelance career. It opened the door to a profession I knew very little about, and attending my first annual conference led to my very first freelance job.
And I joined for the first time in 2004 as a student. My first conference blew my mind. Nowadays, the demand for translators and interpreters is at an all-time high, but finding quality work isn't easy. ATA membership can make the difference. And ATA isn't just for translators and interpreters. We have teachers and professors, hospital administrators, language company owners, and technology developers, just to name a few. Companies and institutions can join too. Our membership includes language companies, universities, and government agencies.
If you'd like to know more, go to ATA's website, atanet.org. You can also check out past episodes of this podcast where we talk about the benefits of membership and what's currently happening in the association.
But before you go, please take a quick moment to give us a rating or write a review. Tell us what you like, why you listen, or about your favorite guest. Your feedback is super helpful, and reviews help other listeners find the show too.
We'd really appreciate hearing from you. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Talk to you again soon.